Good day, students. This day's topic is about carbohydrates. For the learning objectives, at the end of this lesson, you're all expected to classify carbohydrates into their respective groups, determine the metabolism of carbohydrates in the body and the mode of action of hormones in carbohydrate metabolism, and lastly, differentiate the types of diabetes mellitus by clinical signs and symptoms. Let us have the basics of carbohydrates. So carbs or carbohydrates are compounds of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen joined together to form molecule. Thus, we have this shortcut CHO, which stands for carbohydrates. And also, take note of this one. For our proteins, we have this nitrogen, which is not found in your carbohydrates. So that is one thing that mainly differentiates your protein from your carbohydrates. And another thing, in carbohydrates, you have to take note that we have 2 molecules of hydrogen and 1 molecule of oxygen, just like water. Just like in the case of glucose. So we have C6, H12, and O6. So you will have a clue that it is a carbohydrate because the concentration of hydrogen is twice as much as those of the carbon molecules. Next one, we have the carbohydrates as immediate source of energy, especially of our brain, our erythrocytes, and retinal cells of our eyes. Because you have to take note that the nervous tissues cannot concentrate these carbohydrates nor store them. Therefore, it is very critical to maintain a steady supply of glucose and other carbohydrates to the tissues. Next, it serves as a major entry point to the metabolic pathway, because any disturbances to the levels of these carbohydrates may lead to some pathologic conditions just like diabetes mellitus. And lastly, we have the fiber, which is also a form of carbohydrate, is essential for the elimination of waste materials and toxins from the body. So this fiber is very important because it decreases the absorption of cholesterol and bile, and also it decreases our intake of fatty foods by making us feel full, or in short, we have this feeling of satiety. So where do carbohydrates come from? So I know you are very familiar with this process already. So in the process of photosynthesis. So this is where we get our carbohydrates from our plant sources. So in this illustration, we can see here that the sun's energy becomes part of the glucose molecule, its calories in a sense. So this is the glucose molecule, and what is happening here, as we learned in our previous years, is that the chlorophyll in the plant captures the light energy coming from the sun, which is transformed into a chemical energy in the form of ATP. So this chemical energy now is used to combine the carbon dioxide and water in the environment to form this glucose molecule. So the byproduct of that process is the oxygen. That's why your plants could release oxygen. And then the extra glucose is stored in plants as starch. So that is the storage form of carbohydrates in plants, the starch. And another thing, in the molecule of the glucose here, in this leaf, the black dots here represent the carbon atoms, and the bars now represent the chemical bonds that contain energy. So that is where our carbohydrates come from. For the classifications, we have 3 general classifications of carbohydrates: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So these monosaccharides, they are considered as the building blocks of carbohydrates, and they are sugars containing approximately 3 to 6 carbon atoms. And for the examples, we have glucose, fructose, and galactose. So these are monosaccharides, and they are also reducing sugars. And take note that the glucose here is considered as the central to the carbohydrate metabolism, because in a way, we measure the total carbohydrate used by the body when we measure glucose, because this galactose and this fructose are also converted to glucose before it can be used up by the body. So just like, for example, if the patient has galactosemia, so that patient will have a difficulty in converting galactose to glucose. So that's why there is a build-up of this galactose in the blood of that patient. Another thing, we have ribose and deoxyribose as examples of monosaccharides. So these are part, of course, of the structures of our RNA and DNA, which are involved in our genetic code. So these glucose, fructose, and galactose are hexoses because approximately they have 6 carbon atoms. And this ribose and deoxyribose are pentoses because approximately they have 5 carbon atoms in their structures. How about the disaccharides? So the disaccharides are double structures of monosaccharides. So in short, we have 2 monosaccharides per molecule of disaccharide. So we have these examples, sucrose, maltose, and lactose. So they have 2 monosaccharides in their molecule. And take note, each one of them has a glucose molecule. So for the sucrose, it is glucose plus fructose. For maltose, we have glucose and glucose. So this maltose has 2 glucose molecules. And for the lactose, we have glucose and galactose. So the sucrose here, we commonly use this one every day. So this is our table sugar, and also it can be found in honey. And for the maltose, they are usually found in grains, and lactose, of course, in the dairy products and in milk, for example. Next, we have the polysaccharides. So these polysaccharides are long chains of monosaccharides, or they are polymers of monosaccharides. So they are the most abundant types of carbohydrates. So we have examples, starch, glycogen, and cellulose. So all of these are polysaccharides. And I have mentioned earlier that this starch is considered as the storage form of carbohydrate in plants. And this glycogen, on the other hand, is considered as an animal starch because it is a storage form of carbohydrates in animals. So those are for your polysaccharides. And also, we have another one, the cellulose. So this cellulose is also coming from the plants. So this is not digested by humans. So they just provide proper form or bulk in stool for our intestine functions or for proper intestinal functioning. So by knowing the classifications of the carbohydrates, we can therefore say that the main dietary sources of carbohydrates are the starch and disaccharides, because again, the cellulose here, which is also a polysaccharide, remains undigested. So again, this comes from the plants and it is not changed in our digestion process. Its main function is it contributes to the bulk of our stool. Because unlike the termites, for example, we don't have necessary enzymes such as cellulase to degrade this type of cellulose. That's why, again, they remain undigested. So how about the glycogen? So as mentioned earlier, this glycogen is a type of polysaccharide. This glycogen is an animal starch, and it is the excess carbohydrate stored in the liver and in the muscles. But you have to take note that the glycogen in the muscles will be used up by the muscles only, whereas the glycogen in the liver will be used up by the cells of our body, because this liver has glucose 6-phosphatase, which the muscles don't have. So this liver has the enzyme glucose 6-phosphatase, which is necessary for the metabolism of the glucose. And another thing, the other name of glycogen is endogenous carbohydrates. So that means at those times when the body is not taking in carbohydrate from eating, for example, so the glycogen will break down to form glucose to help maintain the proper blood levels of glucose. And also, meats are not good sources of carbohydrates, because upon death, the glycogen or the animal starch easily disintegrates in the animal body. So therefore, we only have 2 types of carbohydrates which contribute to human nutrition, and those are starch and various disaccharides. For the digestion of starch, we have the enzyme amylase, which is necessary for the breakdown of this carbohydrate. But you have to take note that the salivary amylase is not involved in the digestion of starch because it is inactivated by the acidity when it reaches the stomach. So in short, it's only the pancreatic amylase which is mainly responsible for starch digestion. And also, the digestion of starch occurs in our small intestine. So when the food reaches the stomach and the intestinal tract, it will now send biochemical signals to the pancreas. So the pancreatic secretions and of course the bile coming from the liver will neutralize the acidity in the stomach, and in short, they will change the pH into a more basic one to digest the starch. So that is what is happening when the starch reaches our digestive system. So remember that we take in our food as a polysaccharide, usually in the form of starch. So upon reaching our intestinal tract, these polysaccharides now will be broken down and will be converted into disaccharides, then into monosaccharides, and into simple sugars such as glucose. So for the digestion of the disaccharides, we have the enzymes which are produced in the walls of small intestine. So for the sucrose, we have the enzyme sucrase. For the lactose, we have the enzyme lactase, which will degrade the lactose into glucose and galactose. And for the maltose, we have the maltase, which will degrade the maltose molecule into 2 glucose molecules. Now, what happens to the carbohydrate taken into the body? So we have 4 processes described here, which are mainly the functions of your liver. So first, we have glycogenesis. So glycogenesis, by the name itself, genesis, meaning there is the formation of something. So there is, in this process, the formation of glycogen, because glycogenesis is the building up of glycogen. So in this process, glucose is converted to glycogen for storage. So storage in our muscles and our liver. Next one, we have the process glycogenolysis. So glycogenolysis is the opposite of glycogenesis, because in this case, the lysis here gives us an idea that we are breaking down something. So in this case, we are breaking down glycogen and convert it to glucose. So this usually happens during starvation. Next one, we have gluconeogenesis. So gluconeogenesis means the production of glucose from new sources. Neo means new. New sources or other sources such as non-carbohydrate sources like amino acids and fatty acids. Also, this process is not only done by your liver but also by your kidneys. Next one, glycolysis. So glycolysis, this is the process of converting glucose and other hexoses into pyruvate and lactate. This one is the process where we get our energy sources from these substances, the pyruvate and the lactate. So those are the roles of your liver in carbohydrate metabolism. Also, we have the term lipogenesis. So how do you understand this one? So lipogenesis is the conversion of carbohydrates into fatty acids. How about this one? Lipolysis. So lipolysis, this means the breakdown of lipids or the decomposition of lipids or fats. So those are the other terms associated to carbohydrate metabolism. Now let's have the roles of hormones in carbohydrate metabolism. So remember that some components of the endocrine system that produces these hormones is found in our alimentary system, and the pancreas is one of this. So our pancreas has 2 general functions, the endocrine function and the exocrine functions. So for the endocrine function, we have the hormones such as the insulin, glucagon, somatostatin, and pancreatic polypeptide. And for the exocrine or digestive function, we have the pancreatic juice with digestive enzyme that neutralize the acidity in the stomach to digest the ingested carbohydrate. So let's have the endocrine functions. So for the hormones, we have first the insulin. So remember, the insulin is a hypoglycemic hormone. So that means it lowers the blood glucose level. So this insulin decreases the blood glucose by increasing the cellular uptake of this glucose molecule. So that is the function of your insulin. Next one, we have the glucagon. So the glucagon has an opposite function because the glucagon is a hyperglycemic hormone. So which means it increases the blood glucose level. So that means it decreases the cellular uptake of glucose. Next, we have somatostatin. So this hormone plays a role in overall endocrine regulation, including growth and neurotransmission. So let me write that one. Neurotransmission. So that's the function of your somatostatin. And lastly, we have the pancreatic polypeptide, which self-regulates pancreatic endocrine and digestive secretion activities. So that's for the functions of your pancreas. Aside from glucagon, we also have other hyperglycemic hormones. So number one, we have epinephrine. So this is produced from the adrenal medulla. So the epinephrine inhibits insulin secretion. So this one, the insulin lowers the blood glucose level. So when it is inhibited by the epinephrine, of course, this will result to increase blood glucose level. That's why your epinephrine is a hyperglycemic hormone. Next one, it increases glycogenolysis and lipolysis, and it is also released during stress. So this is considered as the fight or flight hormone. Next, we have the growth hormone. So the growth hormone decreases the entry of glucose into the cell. So this means it decreases the cellular uptake of glucose. So what will happen if the glucose cannot enter the cell? So the glucose will remain in the blood. That's why we will have an increased blood glucose level because of this growth hormone. And also, your growth hormone increases the process of glycolysis. Next one, we have ACTH or adrenocorticotropic hormone. So this adrenocorticotropic hormone will stimulate the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol, which will result to increased blood glucose level. And also, through the process of glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, blood glucose is increased. And take note that the cortisol is a major glucocorticoid with a diurnal variation, and when we have to get a blood sample from the patient to examine this cortisol level, we need to have some time intervals because this cortisol level is increased at 8 a.m. and it decreases at 4 p.m. Next, we have the thyroxine. So the thyroxine increases blood glucose level through the process of glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, and of course, it increases intestinal absorption of glucose. Talking about the roles of the pancreas and the hormones it produces, I have here the electron micrograph of the islets of Langerhans, which are mainly responsible for producing the hormones which are necessary for carbohydrate metabolism. So let's take a look at this one. So the green and the red colors produce the insulin and glucagon respectively. The green ones are the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans, whereas the red ones are the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans. And the blue color is the nucleus. And incidentally, this islets of Langerhans was discovered by Paul Langerhans in 1869, so the name was coined to him, and he was just 21 years old when he discovered these islets. To further understand the roles of these hormones, particularly the insulin, let's imagine eating. So the foods that we eat usually contain carbohydrates, proteins, fats, salts, fibers, or even toxins. So have you ever think of how your body deals with this intake? If you ate this and you have no means to control the glucose in your blood, it would reach toxic levels and eventually it would kill you. And that's where the pancreas comes into the picture. So when you eat, the body breaks down the food that we take into glucose. And glucose, again, is a type of sugar, a monosaccharide, that is your body's main source of energy. And as the blood glucose rises, the body will now send signal to the pancreas, specifically to the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans, which will release the hormone insulin. And acting as a key. So this is the insulin. So acting as a key, the insulin will bind to the cellular receptors which will unlock the cell so that the glucose can pass into it. And this glucose entry into the cell is what we call as the cellular uptake of glucose. And there inside of the cell, the glucose is used for energy right away. And you have to take note that blood glucose goes up and down throughout the day. And as your blood glucose rises, like after a meal, the pancreas will continue to release insulin to regulate the blood glucose level and to lower it, returning to its baseline level. So in this another illustration, we can see that the insulin is necessary so that the glucose can enter the cells of the body. So just like the adipose tissues, the muscles, and the liver cells. So this is in the bloodstream wherein after eating, the blood glucose rises. So in order to lower this blood glucose, it must be transferred to the cells of the body to be used as an immediate energy source. So what will happen now is when the insulin binds to the cellular receptors, there will be a conformational change that will happen, which will send signal to the nucleus of the cell to release the glucose transport channels. So actually, these glucose transport channels are the one that enable the entry of glucose from the bloodstream into the cell. And once inside the cell, the glucose can now be used as an immediate energy source. So that is how the body metabolizes the glucose, and with the help of our pancreas and our insulin, our blood glucose is regulated. Now let's take a look at the normal feedback loop of our body in regulating the blood glucose level. So this illustration shows the normal level of blood glucose and also the baseline levels of the hormones insulin and glucagon. So let's take a look on how our body maintains and regulates the glucose. So when we eat, the food is broken down into simple sugars and digested in our small intestine. So after that, the blood glucose level increases, which will eventually send signal to pancreas to produce insulin, returning the blood glucose to normal. So when the blood glucose is normalized, the insulin will return to its baseline level. And hours after eating, the food is gone, so the blood glucose decreases. And during this time, the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans will now produce glucagon to normalize the blood glucose level, eventually returning back the glucagon to its baseline level. Now, what happens when these feedback loops fail? So what if our body produces very little amount of insulin only? Or what if the pancreas cannot produce insulin at all? So we will develop diseases such as diabetes mellitus. And we have two types of diabetes mellitus, the type 1 and the type 2 DM. So for the type 1 DM, it is classified as insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus. Whereas for the type 2, it is non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. So let's differentiate the two types. So for type 1, this results from the body's failure to produce insulin. So that means the pancreas cannot produce insulin. So we cannot utilize glucose as our energy source. And usually this is caused by a virus or autoimmunity attacking the pancreas. And in this case, the person has to inject insulin usually all throughout his or her lifespan. For the type 2, it's classified as insulin resistance. So meaning to say, the pancreas can't produce insulin. However, the cells are resistant to the insulin production. So the cells fail to use insulin properly. And this type 2 DM is the most common form. And again, the insulin resistance in these peripheral tissues or cells is frequently associated with aging, if ever you have a family history of diabetes, or maybe because of obesity and a failure to exercise. And usually, the type 2 DM manifests symptoms such as hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia. And another thing, the type 1 DM, the onset of which is usually in childhood. Whereas for the type 2, it's usually adulthood. And for the type 1, it has diabetic ketoacidosis. So why do we have this ketoacidosis? Remember, in type 1 DM, there is no insulin production. So that means we cannot use the glucose as an energy source. So our body will use our fats instead. And the fats are broken down, and the result of that is the keto acid or the ketone bodies. That's why we can see ketoacidosis in type 1 DM. Whereas for the type 2, we only have rare ketoacidosis. Next one, the frequency of type 1 DM is only 10 to 15% because again, type 2 DM is more common with a frequency of 85 to 90%. Another type of diabetes occurs during pregnancy. So we call it as gestational diabetes. So the pregnant women who have never had diabetes before developed a high blood glucose level during pregnancy. So that is gestational diabetes. Another one, so recently, a study was published showing a new type of diabetes which is associated with Alzheimer's disease. So this is the type 3 DM. And in this study, it was found out that the type 3 diabetes mellitus corresponds to a chronic insulin resistance, just like the type 2 DM. But in this case, there is an insulin deficiency state that is largely confined to the brain. So that is the study of the Journal of Diabetes Science and Technology. And also, the results from these studies provide strong evidence in support of the hypothesis that Alzheimer's disease represents a form of diabetes mellitus that selectively afflicts our brain cells. And also, this study showed that the type 2 DM was not deemed sufficient to cause Alzheimer's disease, although it could possibly serve as a cofactor in the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease. So you can visit this link in order to check for this new article about the type 3 diabetes mellitus. Now let's have the signs and symptoms of diabetes mellitus. So first, we have the type 1 diabetes mellitus. So in this type of diabetes, insulin is not produced. So either because of virus or autoimmunity or any other factors that might destroy the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans. And that is also the reason why there is a continued elevation of blood glucose level while the insulin level remains low. And this is also the reason why a patient needs to inject insulin because, again, the pancreas cannot make its own insulin. For type 2 diabetes mellitus, the pancreas here can produce insulin, but the cells of the body becomes resistant to it. And sometimes this is also due to fat deposits or obesity, just like in this picture. So you can see fat deposits in the body of the patient. But you have to remember that it can also happen in people with a healthy normal weight. So in this type of diabetes, what you can see are elevated levels not only of glucose but as well as of the insulin. So as the blood glucose continues to rise, the insulin will be produced from the pancreas as a response to increased blood glucose levels. So that's why both of them are increased. But there will come a point in time where the pancreas will get exhausted or the pancreas will be destroyed and waver out, resulting to decreased insulin levels. So in this case, in this time, the patient already needs insulin injection, just like in type 1 DM. So one of the symptoms of diabetes mellitus is increased urination, or medically known as polyuria. So this happens because as the glucose in the blood increases, the body tries to compensate it and decrease its level by the kidney. So in short, we are eliminating excessive amounts of glucose in our blood through our urine output. Another one, the patient also experiences excessive thirst or polydipsia. So as the kidney tries to filter the glucose in the blood, so the water goes along with it. And we lose a lot of water. That's why we feel thirsty most of the time if we have diabetes. Another one, the patient can feel tired and and can feel excessively hungry, or what we call as polyphagia. Remember, in diabetes, the blood glucose cannot be used up by the cells of the body. That's why the patient might feel tired, lethargic, or unable to do daily routines because of lack of energy. Another one, there is this thrush or genital itching. Since the urine contains a lot of glucose, this now creates a lot of bacteria to thrive in the genital region, producing these kinds of infection. Next one, there is slow healing of wounds because, again, when we have a lot of glucose in the blood, the viscosity of our blood increases. So that now also affects the flow of oxygen all throughout our body. And also, this is a suitable environment for the bacteria to grow. So that's why we have slow healing of wounds. Another one, we have blurred vision. So the glucose does not only build up in our blood or does not only accumulate in our blood, but it can also stay and build up in the lens of our eyes and causing the liquid of our eyes to become cloudy. So it could result to blurred vision or worse, blindness. Also, there is weight loss. So this is very particular in type 1 diabetes mellitus because again, if we have DM, the glucose cannot be utilized by the body as an immediate source of energy. So instead, the body will use our fats. That's why we also have ketoacidosis, most particularly in type 1 diabetes mellitus. So that is the reason why we have these ketone bodies because our fats are broken down. So we can see ketone bodies in our blood. So that leads to diabetic ketoacidosis. And also, we have these chronic complications of diabetes as a result of those pathogenesis of diabetes. So we have blindness, kidney disease, nerve damage, cardiovascular diseases, stroke, heart attack, loss of circulation in arms and legs that could lead also to amputation. So that ends my discussion. I hope you learned something. Thank you so much.